Hey guys, are you trying to achieve realistic looking fur with watercolors but you're struggling to know how to do that? In this tutorial, I'm going to show you how I painted this lynx using watercolor step by step and give you some really useful tips for working with watercolor in general. I'm Kirsty Rebecca and I make drawing and painting tutorials that are easy to follow even if you're just starting out. If you want to follow along with a full-length, real-time version of this tutorial where I talk you through every step of the process, then I have that available for you over on Patreon. There's a link in the description if you want to check it out. For this piece, I'm using Fabriano Artistico hot pressed traditional white watercolor paper. I find that the hot pressed is a little bit easier to get finer lines on because it's a little bit smoother than the cold press, but you can still do this with the cold press paper if you like. So the first thing I did was actually to lighten up my outline. I used a graphite based transfer paper to get my outline down, so it does have quite a lot of graphite on my piece here, so I wanted to just lighten that up a little bit before I go in with my watercolors. So I'm just using a kneaded eraser and just pressing and lifting. And the reason that I'm using a kneaded eraser instead of a normal eraser is because when you use a normal eraser, it rubs out pretty much the entire line, and you can also damage the paper by rubbing with a normal eraser. So by using a kneaded eraser and just pressing and lifting, you're only lifting up a little bit of the graphite, leaving some of that outline there, but much lighter than it was. So the main thing that you need to know when creating realistic fur texture is to actually build up the piece in light layers. So you want to make sure that you're adding a few brush strokes throughout each layer and then just build up layers with more brush strokes in each layer to just build up that fur texture, because in nature, fur is built up of a lot of layers. So by imitating that in your painting, it will actually help create the illusion of many layers of fur. I'm using indigo in the dark areas, so this is a really dark sort of blue kind of color, and I will add black towards the end as well. And the reason that I'm adding indigo first is because if you just use black straight away, even in those super dark areas, it can look really quite flat if you have it just black by itself. But when you mix in other colors with it, like blues or purples or reds or whatever's in your reference photo, if you mix that color in with black, it actually looks much richer and more vibrant than using black by itself. For a lot of my more expressive watercolor paintings, I like to use the wet on wet technique, which is where the paper is wet, then you come in with paint in that area and it sort of spreads out and blends into the next area. If that makes sense, it makes a nice smooth transition between your colors. But when you want crisp lines, that's where you want to do a wet on dry technique. So you want to make sure that the paper is dry, and then you can come in with your colors and the brush strokes will actually stay where you put them. So it's more useful for creating fur texture and things like that to do wet on dry because it creates crisper lines and edges. So for the entire lynx itself, I just used the wet on dry technique. So when you're building up your layers of watercolor, just remember that the watercolor will actually lighten quite a bit when it's dry, so you can go a little bit darker than you think you need. So when you're actually creating your fur texture with your brush strokes, there are a few things that are quite useful to know. So when you're creating fur in any medium, you want to make sure that your brush strokes are the right length. So in certain areas of the lynx, the fur is slightly longer, like inside the ears, for example, whereas there are some areas where the fur is sort of a medium length, like on the cheeks, and then really short fur, like on the bridge of the nose. So you want to make sure that your brush strokes that you're doing represent how long the fur is in that area. In addition to having your fur be the right length, you want it to go in the right direction as well. So you really want to pay attention to your reference photo and see which direction the fur is actually going in, because especially in areas like around the eyes and the nose kind of area, it varies quite a bit. Make sure that you're looking at each area and then change the direction of your brush strokes to match that area. That being said, you still want to vary your strokes as well. So even though they're going in the right general direction, you want some to start and stop at different points or curve slightly differently or overlap each other. You don't want them all to line up in a row because it can look quite unnatural like that. Before I share my next tip, if you'd like to improve your drawing and painting skills even further, then my Patreon channel is the solution for you. From as little as $4 per month, you will have access to every tutorial that I've previously uploaded on your chosen tier level in a variety of mediums like pastel, colored pencil, charcoal, watercolor, and more. There are tutorials available for a range of subjects like wildlife, birds, landscapes, still life, flowers, and portraits. If you would like to view the entire Patreon tutorial library before joining us, I'll also leave that link in the description for you as well. Not only are my tutorials full length, real time, and fully narrated with clear instructions and explanations, but you will also have access to the original reference photo, a traceable outline, and a list of supplies including the exact color names I'm using, so you really can relax and follow along every step of the way. Every month, I upload brand new tutorials to the Patreon library, so you can grow and develop your drawing and painting skills and take your art to the next level. You can also join in on our members chat group where you can ask questions or advice, or share your artwork, and you can talk to other members in the Patreon community. And the best part is that there are no lock-in contracts, so you can upgrade or downgrade to a different tier level, or you can cancel your pledge at any time if Patreon isn't right for you. So why not give it a go? The link is in the description if you want to check it out. In the areas that have really short fur, like on the nose, sometimes it's actually better to not include the fur detail there. And that's because when you're painting something of this size, you may not actually be able to see a lot of those fur strokes in the areas that have short fur. And if you go and add brush strokes to create some fur texture there, it can look quite wiry and a bit too long for that area. So in some of the areas where there's actually really short fur, I didn't actually put any brush strokes in that area, and I just kept it one sort of color or a variation of different colors in that area rather than trying to concentrate on the brush strokes. And another thing to keep in mind is that you don't actually have to add every strand of fur. In fact, it will look a lot better if you don't do that. So when working in watercolor especially, it's a little bit more of a loose medium than working in colored pencil or pastel. So if you do try and add in every piece of fur detail over the entire piece, it can look a little wiry and just really kind of uniform. So to keep it looking a little bit softer, a little bit more of that loose kind of watercolor style, but also a bit realistic, try not to add thousands of tiny brush strokes. Just be strategic with where you actually place them. So just give that general gist of the fur texture. You don't have to do every single stroke there. You can just paint in that area with those different colors and then come through and add in the general gist of that fur detail there. One of the things that I like to do is add a little bit more detail in the areas that I want to be more in focus. So for example, the eyes and sort of the fur around the eyes and the nose area is a little bit more in focus than the body. So I've put a little bit more detail in the fur texture and the eyes and that kind of thing in comparison to the fur on the body. So that way it sort of draws your attention to that area. When it comes to choosing your colors, people seem to worry about their color choices quite a lot. In this piece, I used a lot of colors that aren't really in the reference photo, or they're just subtly in the reference photo, and I've included way more of that color than what I could see. So when I work, I usually hype up the saturation on my reference photo to bring out some extra colors and add those into my piece. So you don't have to have the exact same colors as what you see in the reference photo. In fact, it can look a lot better if you include some of those colors that you see in that really high saturation version, because it makes it look a little bit more interesting and less flat and more realistic. So for example, you could pick a lot of different reds or browns for this piece, but as long as you get the value right, so as long as it's not too dark or too light, it doesn't have to be the exact same hue, it just needs to be the same value. That's more important than picking the perfect color. When you're trying to make something look realistic, your values and your proportions are probably the most important things. So making sure that your darks and lights are accurate and making sure that your initial outline is accurate. Those two are way more important than trying to pick the right color or adding as much detail as you possibly can. And if you're not sure whether your values are right, you can actually take a picture of your artwork and then actually turn that photo into black and white, and then do the same with your reference photo, turn that into black and white as well, and just compare them side by side. And if your artwork needs to be slightly darker in certain areas, and then go ahead and darken it in that area, that will really dramatically help make something look more realistic. It's usually the dark areas that people don't get dark enough, so if you can do that and compare your artwork with your reference photo and darken up those dark areas, that can really help make something look a lot more realistic. To create the highlights and whiskers, I actually used gouache, and if you don't know what that is, it's almost like an opaque version of watercolor. And the good thing about this is that you can actually mix the gouache with your watercolors to create some more opaque colors. But you can also add a layer of gouache in any areas that you want to create any highlights with, and then glaze watercolor over the top of that. So you can actually tint that white gouache a different color with your watercolors after it's dried. So it's interchangeable with watercolors. You can actually use that and then go back over the top with watercolors and keep layering like that if you want to. And there's nothing wrong with doing this in terms of how archival it will be, but there will be some watercolor purists that don't agree with using gouache or gel pens or other things with watercolor. But honestly, I don't really care what those people think, because what I'm doing is archival and light fast, and it's much easier than trying to actually preserve the whites, especially for things like whiskers. So if you're really trying to get those bright highlights and you want an easier way of doing that, and then gouache is a really great way to do that. If you'd like to see how to create more expressive watercolor pieces, there's a playlist on the screen with some other watercolor tutorials that I thought you might find useful, so click on that and I'll see you over there.